The woman sat in a small cafe on the outskirts of Chicago, her back straight, her eyes cold, and she opened with a sentence no one would expect. My son is turning into a copy of his father. If no one stops him, he'll die the same way his father did. Sitting across from her was a young woman she had never met. The young woman didn't know who this person was, didn't know she had once been the wife of one of the most powerful figures in Chicago's underworld. And she certainly didn't know that the son this woman just mentioned was Grant Harlow, the man who now controlled an empire that the entire city feared. The woman didn't introduce herself. She simply placed a thin folder in front of the young woman and said, "You are the best forensic auditor my people could find. I need you to get inside a corporation, examine the entire financial system, and find me evidence." Evidence of what? Of everything my son is hiding. The young woman looked down at the folder. The cover read 2 words, Harlow Holdings, and right then, her heart skipped a beat. Harlow. A name she had been searching for 3 years. The name behind the shell company where her younger brother once worked before he died at 22 in an accident that police called showing no signs of foul play. But she knew it wasn't an accident. She looked up. "Why me?" The woman answered, "Because I need someone who isn't afraid of the truth, and I believe you have your own reason not to be afraid." The young woman didn't answer right away, but her hand was already resting on the folder. Her name was Tessa Knight. And from the moment she opened that folder, her life was never the same again. If this story touched you, hit like and share it so others can hear it too. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel because the best stories are still ahead. 2 weeks after that meeting at the cafe, Tessa Knight stood in front of the Harlow Holdings building for the first time. The building sat right in the heart of Chicago, its glass facade reflecting the morning sunlight, its exterior looking like the headquarters of any real estate corporation. A bronze nameplate was mounted beside the main entrance, with a simple logo, quiet and unshowy. Nothing suggested that this was the place where the money of an underground empire flowed through every single day. Tessa drew in a deep breath, then stepped inside. She wore a white blouse, a document case in her hand, looking exactly like an outside auditor. No one in the lobby looked at her a second time. She was only a new employee, a name on the personnel list, nothing more and nothing less. And she wanted to keep it that way. The person who greeted her was the chief accountant, a middle-aged man named Bernard, slightly thin, with silver-framed glasses that were always sliding down the bridge of his nose. He shook her hand politely, but without warmth, the kind of handshake from someone who was used to employees coming and going. "Miss Knight, welcome to Harlow Holdings. I'll guide you through the financial system of the restaurant chain during your first week." Bernard led her to the 12th floor in a private elevator. Along the hallway, Tessa observed everything. The work floor was so quiet she could hear the sound of her own footsteps on the stone floor. Employees sat behind their desks, eyes fixed on their screens. No one made small talk. No one laughed. This kind of silence wasn't because of concentration. It was the silence of people who knew the walls had ears. Bernard brought her into a small office in the corner of the floor, with 1 desk, 1 computer, and 3 boxes of files already arranged there. These are the financial records of the 14 restaurants in the Harlow dining chain. Revenue, operating expenses, supplier contracts, and tax reports for the last 3 years. You'll start here. Tessa looked at the 3 boxes of files. "Do I have access to the central accounting system?" Bernard adjusted his glasses. "Not yet. In the first phase, you'll work with the hard copies first. System access will be granted after leadership approves it." Tessa nodded, showing no disappointment. She had expected this. An organization like Harlow never opened its doors to a stranger on the first day. She had to earn their trust first. Bernard left the room after giving her a few instructions about internal procedures. The door closed. Tessa sat down, opened the first box of files, and began reading page by page, number by number, contract by contract. On the surface, everything was clean. Revenue was reasonable. Expenses were structured. Taxes were paid on time. At a glance, this was a well-run restaurant chain with stable profits and nothing suspicious. But Tessa wasn't an ordinary auditor. She had been in this profession long enough to know one thing. Illegal money never sat on the first page. It hid in repeated expenses no one questioned. In suppliers no one checked. In numbers so perfectly round they didn't feel natural. And she would find it. She worked straight through until 6 o'clock in the evening. When employees in the other offices began shutting down their computers and leaving, Tessa was still sitting there. She finished reading the first box, marked 4 items that needed to be checked again, and began opening the second box. By 8 o'clock at night, she was the only one left on the 12th floor. The hallway lights had shifted into energy-saving mode, glowing only dimly. Tessa stopped, leaned back in her chair, and looked around the small office. 3 years ago, when she received the call saying Jamie had been in an accident, she had been sitting in an office exactly like this one. The same kind of desk, the same fluorescent light, the same smell of old paper. Only one thing was different. Back then, she didn't know what she was looking for. Now she did. Tessa took a small notebook from her handbag, the leather-covered kind she always carried with her. She opened the first page, wrote the date, and beneath it wrote a single line. Inside now. She closed the notebook, slipped it back into her handbag, turned off the desk lamp, and left the building. Outside, Chicago at night was noisy and blazing with light. But Tessa didn't look. She walked quickly to the parking lot, got into her car, and locked the doors. In the darkness of the car, she sat still for a few seconds. Then she started the engine and drove away. The hunt had begun. In her second week at Harlow Holdings, Tessa received an internal email from Bernard. 15th floor conference room, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Present the preliminary report on the restaurant chain. She was already prepared. After 2 weeks of reading hard copy files, she had noted more than 20 points that needed clarification, including 4 items she had marked in red because the numbers didn't match between the revenue reports and the supplier invoices. She arranged the documents neatly in her case and took the elevator to the 15th floor. This floor was completely different from the 12th. The hallway was wider, the ceiling higher, the carpet thicker. The conference room was at the end of the hall, behind a frosted glass door, and 5 people were already seated inside. Bernard sat near the door. Beside him were 2 restaurant managers Tessa had never met before, an in-house lawyer, and a man in a gray suit whom she guessed was the operations director. They were speaking quietly among themselves when Tessa walked in. Bernard introduced her briefly and pulled out a chair for her to sit across from them. Tessa had just opened her document case when the conference room door opened again. The entire room fell silent at once. No one gave a signal. No one said, "Be quiet," or "The boss is here." The 5 people who had been talking simply stopped, as if the entire room had suddenly frozen. Tessa looked up. The man who entered was tall, his steps firm, neither hurried nor slow. He didn't greet anyone, didn't look at anyone, didn't introduce himself. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table, sat down, then opened a file he had brought with him. Tessa recognized it immediately. It wasn't a restaurant file. It was her file. She saw her name on the first page, an old identification photo from when she was still working in New York, and small lines of text she couldn't read from that distance. Bernard lowered his head toward the table, his hands resting on his lap, and Tessa noticed that his fingers were tightening around each other. The man flipped through 2 pages, stopped at one place, then looked directly at Tessa for the first time. "Morrison and Blake, where you used to work. Recently, they were sued for an audit error that caused a client to lose more than $12 million. His voice was low, never rising, without emphasis or flourish, but every word was clear, as though it had been weighed before it was spoken. Tessa hadn't expected him to know that detail. The lawsuit hadn't made major headlines. It had been settled outside court, and the records were sealed. An ordinary person couldn't have found that information unless someone had dug very deep. She looked straight into his eyes. "I was the one who discovered that error. I reported it to the board of directors. They chose not to address it. I resigned 3 weeks later." He didn't nod. He didn't show satisfaction or disappointment. He only looked at her. 3 seconds, without saying anything. Those 3 seconds were longer than any question. Tessa held his gaze, didn't lower her eyes, didn't look away. She understood by instinct that this was a test, and if she looked down first, she would fail. Then he closed the file, stood up, and left the room. Not one more word. The entire meeting lasted less than 4 minutes. The door closed. The 5 people in the room exhaled at the same time, almost in unison, as though they had been holding their breath from the moment he walked in. Bernard took out a handkerchief and dabbed his forehead. The in-house lawyer kept turning a pen in his hand without writing anything. The 2 restaurant managers looked at each other, then lowered their faces to the documents in front of them. Tessa sat still. She didn't know that man's name yet. No one had introduced him. But she didn't need an introduction. She had understood from the way the whole room reacted. That was Grant Harlow, and he was dangerous in a way she had never encountered before. Not the kind of danger that came from men who shouted and threatened. She had met that kind already. In courtrooms, in conference rooms, in tense negotiations back when she was still working in New York. That kind was loud and predictable. Grant Harlow was different. He was quiet. He knew things he shouldn't have known. He asked exactly one question, looked exactly once, and then walked away. And the most frightening thing was that she couldn't guess what he was thinking after those 3 seconds of silence. Was he satisfied? Suspicious? Had he already decided something about her? She didn't know. And not knowing, for Tessa, was more dangerous than any threat. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes after that with Bernard and the managers, but Tessa gave her presentation in a state of half-focus. The other half of her mind was still processing the 4 minutes that had just happened. When the meeting ended, she returned to her office on the 12th floor, closed the door, and sat down in her chair. She opened the leather-covered notebook, but she didn't write anything. She only sat there, looking at the blank page, and thought, I'm playing on someone else's field, and that person knows more about me than I thought. Meanwhile, in the hallway on the 15th floor, Grant Harlow stepped out of the private elevator. His bodyguard was already waiting outside. Grant didn't stop walking. He went straight toward his private office, but as he passed the bodyguard, he said just loudly enough to be heard, "The new auditor. Watch her. Every contact, every call, every time she enters or leaves the building. Report to me every day." The bodyguard nodded. Grant pushed open the office door and disappeared behind the thick oak door. On the 12th floor, Tessa was still sitting in front of the open notebook. She didn't know that from this moment on, every step she took inside this building was being recorded. The first month passed slowly. Tessa arrived at the office at 8 o'clock in the morning and left at 9 or 10 o'clock at night, sometimes even later. She read every page of the ledgers, every invoice, every supplier contract for the 14 restaurants in the Harlow dining chain. Most of the numbers were clean, presented professionally, and in proper accounting form. But by the 3rd week, Tessa began to notice something she had almost missed. In 3 restaurants on the south side of Chicago, there was an expense labeled routine maintenance that appeared steadily every month. The amount wasn't large, only about $4,000 each time, small enough that no one would bother looking too closely. But Tessa looked closely. She compared the maintenance invoices against the service provider contracts. The provider was named Greenfield Services. She searched the system. Greenfield had no website, no clear office address, and the contact phone number matched another real estate company that also belonged to the Harlow ecosystem. The expense repeated for 18 consecutive months, steady as a clock, always the same amount, always the same day of the month. Tessa knew this was a classic sign of money being created to circle around. Money flowed out of the restaurants through fake maintenance invoices, then came back under another name. She wrote a brief report, clearly noting the discrepancy and raising a question about Greenfield Services. The next morning, she placed the report on Bernard's desk. After Bernard finished reading it, his face changed. Not much, but enough for Tessa to understand. Either he didn't know about this expense, or he knew and hadn't expected anyone to find it. Bernard said nothing to her. He only nodded, took the report, and went up to the 15th floor. That afternoon, Tessa received an internal email. Level 2 access to the central accounting system had been activated for her account. There was no explanation. No call from Bernard, only an automated email from IT. But Tessa understood. This order had come from Grant Harlow. She had proven her ability, and the door had just opened one step wider. Once she had Level 2 access, Tessa began to see more. The financial system of Harlow Holdings had many layers. The outermost layer was the restaurants, clean and legal. The second layer was the real estate companies, buying and selling land, leasing commercial spaces. But between those 2 layers, there were money transfers Tessa still couldn't explain. Money flowed from the restaurants to the real estate companies, and from there to accounts she didn't yet have permission to view. She knew she was getting close, and she knew she needed to back up the data before someone realized where she was looking. That night, Tessa stayed at the office until 10 o'clock. The 12th floor was completely empty. She opened the system, accessed the transaction files between the restaurants and the real estate companies, then plugged a USB drive into the computer port. The files began copying. The progress bar moved slowly, 1% at a time. Tessa looked at the screen, then at the office door, then back at the screen. 30%, 50%, 70%. Then the screen flickered. A notification window appeared in the right corner. Routine security scan is starting. All peripheral devices will be checked in 2 minutes. Tessa's heart pounded so hard she felt it in her throat. 2 minutes. The files had only copied to 80%. She couldn't wait. Tessa canceled the transfer, pulled out the USB drive, and slipped it into her shirt pocket. Then she opened the access history and deleted the log from the last 30 minutes. Her hands typed quickly, but her fingers kept slipping because of sweat. She had to brace one hand against the edge of the desk to steady herself while the other kept working. 1 minute and 40 seconds. She finished deleting the log, closed every window, and exited the system. 1 minute and 55 seconds. She unplugged the laptop charger, turned off the screen, and pushed the chair back under the desk. 2 minutes. The computer screen switched into scan mode. The small light on the hard drive blinked steadily. Tessa stood at the office door, document case in hand, the USB drive in her shirt pocket, her heart still refusing to slow down. She walked to the elevator with normal steps, nodded to the security guard in the lobby, and stepped out through the main entrance as if this were only an ordinary evening of overtime. But when she got into her car and closed the door, she had to place both hands on the steering wheel and sit still for 30 seconds before she could start the engine. That night, Tessa made a decision. She would never use a USB drive inside the building again. Too risky. From now on, she would memorize the numbers in her head, then go home and write them down by hand. Slower, but safer. In her small rented apartment in the West Loop, Tessa sat at the kitchen table under the yellow light. In front of her was the leather-covered notebook. She wrote down every number she could remember, every company name, every transaction date. When she finished writing, she hid the notebook in the narrow gap between the bottom of the bed and the floor. Then she sat on the bed and looked toward the nightstand. There was a small photograph there in a wooden frame. Jamie, smiling wide on the day of his college graduation, holding his diploma high long before that tragic accident took him away. Tessa looked at the photograph longer than usual. Then she whispered, her voice just loud enough for herself to hear, "I'm getting close, Jamie." Every night, after the last employee left the building, Grant Harlow sat alone in his office on the 15th floor and opened the security camera system. He didn't watch everything. He only watched the 12th floor. The screen showed 4 different angles: the hallway, the server room, the printing area, and the small office in the corner of the floor, where Tessa Knight sat. It was the same every night. At 8 o'clock in the evening, the 12th floor was empty. Only one person remained. She sat in front of the computer, completely absorbed in her work, her eyes fixed on the screen, her hand constantly writing notes in the small notebook. From time to time, she stopped, flipped through a stack of files beside her, compared the numbers, then turned back to the screen. 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. Some nights, it was nearly 11 o'clock before she shut down the computer. Grant had seen many kinds of employees in his life. Those who worked hard to make an impression usually stayed late for the first few weeks, then returned to normal hours. Those who were ambitious found ways to approach people with power, have lunch with the right people, say the right words at the right time. Tessa didn't belong to either kind. She didn't try to impress anyone. She didn't have lunch with coworkers. She didn't ask Bernard about the company structure or try to meet Grant again. She only read. She read with the intensity of someone searching for one specific thing among thousands of pages. And that was exactly what made Grant unable to ignore her. One morning, he called his bodyguard into the office. Report on the auditor. The bodyguard opened a thin file. Tessa Knight, 27 years old, born in Philadelphia. Formerly worked as an auditor at Morrison & Blake in New York for 4 years. She resigned shortly after that lawsuit. After that, no official employment record for nearly 2 years. Moved to Chicago 2 months ago. Rented a small apartment in the West Loop. Paid 3 months in cash up front. Lives alone. No friends in Chicago. No relatives nearby. No recorded romantic relationship. Outside contact? Grant asked. Almost none, sir. She hasn't called anyone except for a few short calls to the insurance company and the landlord. No notable personal emails. No meetings with anyone outside work hours. Grant sat still. A person with no friends, no family, no outside contact. Taking a job at a strange company in a strange city, then working 14 hours a day. Nothing was wrong on the surface, but Grant didn't believe in surfaces. 20 years in this world had taught him one thing. The cleaner someone looked, the more suspicious they were. Everyone had something, a connection, a weakness, a reason. Tessa Knight was clean to an unusual degree, and anything unusual always had a cause. "Keep watching," Grant said, "but don't approach her. Don't let her know." The bodyguard nodded, then left the room. Grant didn't order a deeper investigation. Not yet. He wanted to wait. If there was someone behind Tessa Knight, sooner or later that person would make contact, and when that happened, he would know. Meanwhile, on the 12th floor, Tessa began to notice something strange. She had been working at Harlow Holdings for more than a month, and throughout that entire time, not one employee had made things difficult for her. No one asked what she was doing when she stayed late. No one searched her desk when she went out for lunch. No one accidentally opened her computer when she stepped away. In any other company, a new employee hired from outside to examine the books would have been treated warily by the entire office. But here, everyone treated her with cold politeness, keeping just enough distance, neither friendly nor hostile, as if someone had told them, "Leave her alone." Tessa didn't know for certain who had said that, but she could guess, and that truth made her feel both safer and more uneasy. Safer because no one was obstructing her work. Uneasy because if Grant Harlow was protecting her, then he was also watching her. And if he was watching, then the smallest mistake could be her last. That night, on the 15th floor, Grant turned off the camera screen. The office sank into darkness, with only the glow of the city spilling through the glass windows. He sat there for a few more minutes, doing nothing, just looking out at Chicago at night. Then he stood, put on his coat, and left the building. Because tomorrow, he had a meeting he didn't expect. And the person he was about to meet was more dangerous than any auditor. The call came at 3 o'clock in the morning. The manager of the Harlow dining restaurant on the south side was trembling as he spoke. "Boss, they smashed everything. Tables, chairs, glass, the kitchen, nothing is still intact. The night shift employees were threatened. 2 of them quit on the spot." Grant listened without saying anything, then ended the call. He sat on the bed in his penthouse in the Gold Coast, looking out at the darkness of Lake Michigan. He didn't need to ask who was behind it. There was only one person who would dare touch Harlow property without bothering to hide his face: Jonas Novak. The next morning, a message came through a private communication channel known only to those in Chicago's underground world. Novak didn't circle around the point. He wanted to buy all 5 Harlow restaurants on the south side for 1/3 of their actual value. The message ended with one sentence: "This is an offer. Next time, it won't be an offer anymore." Grant read the message twice. Then he called his bodyguard in and said, "Arrange a meeting. The old warehouse in the Bridgeport Industrial District, tonight." The bodyguard looked at him. "You want to meet in person? I want to look him in the eyes." 7 o'clock that evening. The old warehouse in Bridgeport had once been used for storage by a freight company that had closed long ago. This was neutral territory, belonging neither to Harlow nor to Novak. The unwritten rule was simple. Meeting on neutral ground meant neither side wanted war yet, but both were ready for it. Grant arrived 10 minutes early. He brought 4 men with him. They stood on both sides, and no one spoke. The warehouse was wide, with a high ceiling, and industrial lights cast a pale yellow glow from above. It smelled of damp concrete and old machine oil. At exactly 7 o'clock, the warehouse door on the other side opened. Novak walked in. He had also brought 4 men. Novak was nearly as tall as Grant, but heavier, with broad shoulders and the slow stride of a man who was in no hurry to get anywhere. He wore a black leather jacket, carried nothing in his hands, and held an unlit cigar between his lips. He stopped about 5 meters from Grant, looked around the warehouse once, then smiled faintly. "Grant Harlow, finally willing to come out of your glass tower?" Grant didn't answer. He stood straight, both hands hanging naturally at his sides, his eyes fixed on Novak. No expression. Novak pulled the cigar from his mouth and turned it between 2 fingers. "I sent my offer. 5 restaurants on the south side. A reasonable price." "You wreck my restaurant and call that a reasonable price?" Grant said, his voice level. Novak shrugged. "Cost of doing business. Your father understood that." "My father is dead." "Correct. And since he died, this empire has started to crack." Novak spoke slowly, word by word, his voice carrying the pleasure of someone testing the other man's reaction. I'm not the only one who sees it. You know that, Grant. You're holding something too large for one man." Grant still stood motionless. His face didn't change. But inside, he was reading Novak. The way the man stood, the way he spoke, the way his 4 men lined up, the confidence in his voice. This wasn't a man merely straining to look strong. Novak truly had power. He had new money from somewhere, new people, and enough confidence to stand here and look Grant Harlow in the face without blinking. That was the most important piece of information Grant needed from this meeting. Grant stepped forward. Only one step. But Novak's 4 men all shifted their hands at the same time. Grant's 4 men did the same. The air inside the warehouse hardened like concrete. Grant looked straight into Novak's eyes and said, his voice not rising by even a single degree, "You touched one of my restaurants. I won't touch one of yours. I'll touch the thing it would take you 20 years to build again." Novak's smile slowly disappeared. Not completely, but enough for Grant to know the words had landed exactly where they were meant to. The 2 men looked at each other for a few more seconds. Then Grant turned and walked toward the door. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. His 4 men followed behind him. A black car was waiting outside the warehouse gate. Grant got in, the door closed, and the car rolled away. On the way back, he said nothing for the entire 20 minutes. The bodyguard in the front seat didn't dare turn around. At last, Grant spoke. "Novak has a new source of money. Find out where it came from." Then he added, "And call the auditor up to my office tomorrow morning." At 9 o'clock the next morning, Tessa stood in front of Grant's desk on the 15th floor. This was the second time she had been in the same room with him. But this time there weren't 5 other people sitting between them as a buffer. There was only him and her. Grant placed a thin file on the desk and pushed it toward her. "I need you to examine the finances of an outside associate. This file is what we have. I want to know where this person's money comes from, where it flows through, and where it's going." Tessa looked at the file. The cover didn't list a company name. There was only one handwritten name in the right corner, Novak. She had never heard the name before, but she understood immediately. Grant Harlow had just handed her something he wouldn't give to any ordinary employee, a rival's data. "Deadline?" she asked. "As soon as possible." Tessa took the file, nodded, and left the room. On the way back to the 12th floor, with the Novak file tucked under her arm, she realized something more clearly than ever before. She wasn't only digging inside Harlow Holdings anymore. She had just been pulled into the middle of a war between 2 powers. And in the middle of a war, there was no room for outsiders. 2 weeks after the meeting at the warehouse, Tessa worked with 2 streams of data at the same time. By day, she sat on the 12th floor, handling the Harlow dining books as usual. By night, in her apartment in the West Loop, she opened the Novak file Grant had given her and began to read. There wasn't much in the file. A few copies of business contracts, a list of several companies connected to Novak, and preliminary financial reports for 3 businesses under his name. But to Tessa, limited data didn't mean limited information. It meant she had to know how to read between the lines. She began with the question Grant had given her. Where was Novak's money coming from? She created a comparison chart between the revenue of Novak's 3 companies and the actual scale of their operations. The result didn't match. 2 of the 3 companies showed revenue 3 times higher than what was reasonable for their registered industries. Money was flowing in from another source, and these companies were only the outer shell. She wrote it down, but didn't report it yet, because at the same time, she found something else. While digging through Harlow's data at the office, Tessa noticed a strange transaction in the central accounting system. A small transfer, about $2,000, had been made at 2:17 in the morning, on the exact night the Southside restaurant was destroyed. The money went from Harlow Holdings' general operating account to a secondary account Tessa had never seen before. That account had no clear name, only a code number, and the transfer had been made from inside the system, through an internal login account. Someone inside Harlow Holdings had carried out that transaction on the very night the restaurant was attacked. It wasn't a coincidence. This was the sign of an insider. The next morning, Tessa brought the discovery up to the 15th floor. She didn't ask for an appointment. She said to the bodyguard outside the door, "I have important information for Mr. Harlow, right now." The bodyguard looked at her for a few seconds, then opened the door. Grant was sitting behind his desk, reading something on his computer. He looked up when Tessa walked in. She placed a sheet of paper in front of him. On it were the transaction time, the account code, the amount, and the login account that had made it. On the night the South Side restaurant was destroyed, someone inside your system made an unusual transaction. A small amount, easy to overlook, but it shows that someone is planting something inside Harlow's financial system from within. Grant looked at the paper. Then he looked up. For the first time since he had met her in the conference room more than a month earlier, his gaze wasn't the gaze of someone coldly evaluating her. It was the gaze of a man who had just realized that a piece on the board was more valuable than he had thought. He nodded. "I'll handle it." Tessa left the room. She didn't tell Grant that she had dug far deeper than the scope of the restaurant audit. She didn't tell him that she was analyzing Novak's finances and Harlow's finances at the same time, cross-checking the two systems against each other. And she especially didn't tell him about what she had found the night before. Because the night before, while comparing old expenses from Harlow Holdings from 4 years earlier, Tessa discovered a transfer made in the exact month Jamie died. The payment was listed as a special protection service fee, in the amount of $50,000, transferred to a company called Sentinel Guard LLC. Tessa looked up Sentinel Guard. The company was registered in Delaware, had no official employees, and had no real office address, a shell. She dug further. The legal name behind Sentinel Guard was a man named Carl Bremer. Tessa searched for Carl Bremer, and her stomach tightened. Carl Bremer was currently working for Jonas Novak. He was one of Novak's trusted lieutenants, in charge of security for the man's businesses. But 4 years ago, he had worked for Harlow. More specifically, he had worked for Raymond Harlow, Grant's father. Tessa sat staring at the laptop screen in her dark apartment. The chain of information joined itself into a picture she didn't want to look at, but couldn't look away from. $50,000 had been transferred from Raymond Harlow's account, through the shell company Sentinel Guard, into Carl Bremer's hands, at the exact time her younger brother was gone forever. Raymond Harlow had given the order. Carl Bremer had carried it out. Raymond was dead now. Carl now worked for Novak. And Grant Harlow, the man sitting on the 15th floor of the building she walked into every day, wasn't the one who had given the order. 3 years. For 3 years, Tessa had believed the Harlow family was the enemy. For 3 years, she had carried that name inside her like a knife. For 3 years, she had searched, waited, planned, all for the day she would face the person responsible. And now that person was in the ground. The man who had carried it out was on the rival side. And the man now sitting atop this empire, the man she was still quietly gathering evidence against, wasn't the enemy she thought he was. Tessa closed the laptop, pushed back the chair, stood up. She paced through the apartment, from the kitchen to the living room, from the living room to the window, then back again. Her steps were quick, but they went nowhere. She stopped at the window and looked down at the Chicago streets under the pale yellow streetlights. For 3 years, she had known where she stood. Now she didn't know anymore. After Tessa reported the unusual transaction on the night the restaurant was destroyed, everything changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but clearly. Grant began summoning her to meetings she had never been invited to before. Small meetings, 3 or 4 people, held in the private office on the 15th floor instead of the large conference room. The subject was no longer just restaurant bookkeeping. Grant asked her about cash flow structures, about how to detect hidden accounts, about the signs that showed a company was being used as a shell. He asked briefly, without explaining his reasons. And Tessa answered just as briefly, without asking anything back. She understood. Grant didn't trust her. He was using her. She had real practical value, and he needed that value in his war with Novak. But using someone and trusting someone were 2 different things, and Tessa was smart enough not to confuse them. What she hadn't expected was the late-night work sessions. After the closed-door meetings, Grant often stayed in his office until 10 or 11 o'clock at night. Tessa did too, because she was still digging through Harlow data alongside the Novak file. Sometimes, when she went up to the 15th floor to pick up more documents, she saw that the light in Grant's office was still on. The first time the 2 of them spoke about something outside work was on a Thursday night. Tessa came to Grant's office to return a file. He was sitting behind his desk, his suit jacket already taken off and draped over the chair, one hand holding a cup of cold coffee. She placed the file on the desk. Report on Novak's 3 subsidiaries. 2 of them have revenue that doesn't match their scale. I need more data to confirm the 3rd source of money. Grant nodded and flipped through a few pages. Then he asked, without looking up, "Do you work this late every day?" "I'm used to it." "Used to it? Or no reason to go home early?" Tessa didn't answer right away. That question didn't belong in any meeting. It was the question of one person looking at another person and recognizing something familiar. "Both," she said. Grant looked up. "1 second. Then he turned back to the file. "I'll send you more data tomorrow morning." The conversation ended there. There was nothing special about it. But from that night on, the brief exchanges between them began to happen more often. They weren't confessions. They weren't long conversations. Just a few sentences between work, sometimes in the hallway, sometimes in Grant's office, sometimes in the elevator. Grant asked her what she thought about a transaction. Tessa asked him why certain contracts had been signed but never carried out. He answered directly. So did she. And between the questions about numbers and contracts, Tessa realized something. She was the only person in this building who spoke plainly to Grant Harlow. Bernard reported to him in a careful voice. The in-house lawyer chose words the way someone chose a path through a minefield. The restaurant managers answered him with, "Yes, sir." No matter what he said, no one argued. No one asked questions back. No one said, "I think you're wrong." Tessa did. Not because she was brave, but because she had nothing to lose here. She wasn't truly a Harlow employee. She wasn't afraid of being fired. And she had already lost the most important thing in her life. So the things that remained weren't strong enough to make her bow her head. And Grant, though he never admitted it, began speaking to her in a different voice. Not the voice of command, not the voice of interrogation, just a voice a little less heavy, a little less sharp, as if he didn't need to keep his defenses up every time she was in the room. One afternoon, Tessa was getting water in the hallway on the 12th floor when she met someone she had never seen before. He was younger than Grant, with a softer face and a lighter step, without the heavy, certain stride of people who lived in Grant's world. He was holding a stack of papers and seemed to be looking for a room. "Excuse me, where is the administrative office? I'm here to sign paperwork for the charity foundation." Tessa pointed the way. He thanked her, then introduced himself. Drew Harlow. Tessa recognized him at once. Grant's younger brother, the one who ran the only charity foundation in the family. She nodded. "Tessa Knight, audit." Drew gave a small smile. "Ah, you're the one my brother mentioned." Tessa was slightly surprised. "He mentioned me?" "Not directly. But when he says, 'the auditor,' without looking irritated, that already counts as praise." Drew spoke a little more about the charity foundation, about how he was trying to expand the education support program for children on the South Side. Then before he left, he stopped and said, his voice gentle but sincere, "He isn't the person everyone thinks he is. He's just the one who took the heaviest part of this family." Drew nodded goodbye and walked toward the administrative office. Tessa remained standing in the hallway, a cup of water in her hand, watching him go. That sentence wasn't new. She had heard many kinds of excuses made for powerful men, but the way Drew said it, without defending him, without asking for sympathy, only speaking as if he were stating a truth he lived with every day, made her stand still longer than usual. That night, in her apartment in the West Loop, Tessa sat at the kitchen table under the yellow light. She opened the leather-covered notebook. On the left page were the numbers, account codes, company names, and money flows of Harlow Holdings. On the right page were Jamie's name, the date of his death, and the words, Sentinel Guard, Raymond Harlow, Carl Bremer. The 2 pages faced each other, the original target and the truth she had just found. They no longer matched. Tessa closed the notebook. She looked out the window. Chicago at night, the lights of the high rises flickering along the skyline. She had come to this city to find an enemy. But what she was finding was someone trapped just like her. The message arrived on Saturday morning, from a number Tessa hadn't saved but recognized immediately. The number belonged to the woman from the cafe. The message contained only an address and a time, 2:00 in the afternoon. The same old cafe outside Chicago, the place where everything had begun. Tessa looked at the message longer than necessary. The last time she had gone to that cafe, she had been an auditor accepting a job from a stranger. Now she was the person hiding secrets from both sides. She was different now, and this meeting wouldn't be like the last one. 2:00 in the afternoon. Tessa pushed open the cafe door. The woman was already sitting at the innermost table, in the exact same place as before, her back straight, a cup of tea in front of her untouched. She looked up when Tessa arrived. "Sit down, and turn off your phone first." Tessa sat down, but she didn't turn off her phone yet. "Why?" "Because my son watches everyone around him, including me. So we're meeting here, and your phone has to be turned off." Tessa looked at her. That sentence confirmed what she had suspected for weeks. She took out her phone, powered it off, and placed it face down on the table. The woman gave a slight nod. "Good." Then she continued, her voice flat, as if she were reading the weather report. "Last time, I didn't tell you who I was. Now I will. My name is Margaret Harlow. I'm Grant's mother." Tessa didn't move. Her face stayed the same. But inside, everything was rearranging itself. The woman who had hired her, the woman who had brought her into Harlow Holdings, the woman who knew about Jamie, the woman who had provided the first files, was Grant Harlow's mother. A mother was hiring an outsider to break apart her own son's empire. Margaret watched Tessa's reaction. She didn't ask, "Why?" She didn't stand up and leave. She sat still, and Margaret continued, "I need you to move faster. There isn't much time left. Novak is growing stronger, and Grant is confronting him directly, instead of stepping back. Every day he stays in that world, he takes one more step deeper into it. I need evidence heavy enough to force him to dismantle the underground side, willingly or otherwise." "What exactly do you intend to do with that evidence?" Tessa asked. "Put two choices in front of my son. Stop on his own, or the evidence goes to the federal authorities." Tessa looked straight into Margaret's eyes. Margaret didn't look away. Her eyes were sharp, dry, without tears, without hesitation. This was a woman who had made her decision long ago, before meeting Tessa, before hiring the intermediary lawyer, perhaps even before Raymond Harlow died. "The intermediary lawyer," Tessa said. "The person who arranged our first meeting. You're certain he can be trusted?" Margaret tilted her head slightly, as though the question didn't deserve thought. "He worked for my family for 20 years. He handled my husband's will. He's more trustworthy than most people in my life." Tessa remembered that answer. She didn't argue, but she remembered. Then she placed both hands on the table and said what she had wanted to say since discovering the truth about Jamie. "You pushed me into this." Margaret looked at her. "You knew what I was doing inside. You knew that if your son found out, I might not walk out of that building, and you still let me go in. I weighed the risk. You weighed my risk, not yours." Margaret didn't answer. "Your husband once ordered people to do things whose consequences are still reaching into the present. I know that because I'm living with those consequences." Tessa spoke slowly, word by word, her voice not trembling, but heavy. "You say you're different from your husband, but you're using me as a chess piece against your own son. So how are you any different from him?" The cafe was quiet. The sound of the coffee machine at the counter could be heard clearly. Margaret sat motionless. For the first time in a very long while, someone had said something like that directly to her face. Not because the people around her didn't dare, but because no one had been close enough to see what Tessa had just spoken aloud. Margaret was silent. 5 seconds, 10 seconds. Then she said, her voice neither rising nor falling, flat as water before a storm, "Because if I don't act, someone else will, and they won't show mercy. They, Novak, the federal authorities, or the people inside the organization itself, once they see my son weakening. I'm not the only person who wants this empire to change, Miss Knight. I'm only the one who wants my son still alive after it changes." Tessa looked at her. She saw something she didn't want to see. The truth. Margaret wasn't lying. She wasn't performing. She loved Grant. But that love wasn't warm or gentle. It was cold. It calculated. It was willing to cut into the very person it wanted to protect, if that was the only way. "I'll continue," Tessa said. "But not because you asked, because I have my own reasons." Margaret nodded. "I never thought otherwise." Tessa stood, took her phone, and left the cafe without looking back. Outside, the pale gold of a Chicago afternoon lay across the sidewalk. Tessa walked to her car, opened the door, and got in. But she didn't start the engine right away. She sat still in the car, both hands on the steering wheel. She thought about Margaret, about the way she had said "my son" in the voice of someone willing to burn the whole world down if necessary, as long as that child was still standing after the fire. That love was real. Tessa didn't doubt it. But it was so sharp it could cut both ways, both the person being loved and the person being used as the blade. The meeting with Margaret threw Tessa off balance, not because she was afraid, but because she realized she was trapped between two Harlows, one on the 15th floor and one in a cafe outside the city, both dangerous in their own ways, and both using her for their own purposes. She wanted to end it quickly. She wanted to gather enough evidence, wanted to uncover the whole truth about Jamie, wanted to get out before either side realized what game she was playing. And that urgency made her make a mistake. On Monday night, after work, Tessa stayed behind on the 12th floor. The floor was empty. She opened the central accounting system and began accessing files she had never opened before, files that sat above Level 2 clearance, belonging to Harlow Holdings' direct real estate investment division, the place where she suspected the money from the restaurants eventually flowed back to. She knew she was going beyond her scope, but she thought, just 10 minutes, just enough to look at the folder structure, memorize the file names, then get out. 10 minutes. She managed to open 7 files. She skimmed the titles, memorized transaction codes, partner names, amounts. Then she closed the system, shut down the computer, and left the building. She thought she was safe. She wasn't safe. On Tuesday morning, just as Tessa placed her document case on her desk on the 12th floor, the internal phone rang. Grant's bodyguard spoke in a clipped voice. "Mr. Harlow wants to see you. 15th floor. Right now." Tessa set the phone down. Her hands were normal. Her breathing was normal. But in her mind, she was running through every possible scenario. Maybe he wanted to ask more about Novak. Maybe Bernard had a question about the weekly report. Maybe it had nothing to do with anything at all. But she knew. Deep in her gut, she knew. She went up to the 15th floor. The bodyguard opened Grant's office door without a word. Tessa walked in. Grant was sitting behind his desk. The only light in the room came from the large glass window behind him, morning sunlight pouring in and leaving his face in a faint shadow. On the desk, directly in front of him, was a thick file. Tessa looked at that file and knew at once it wasn't a financial report. It was an access log. Grant didn't invite her to sit. She pulled out the chair herself and sat down. He opened the file, turned past the first page, then pushed the whole file toward her. "This is everything you've done since the first day you walked into this building." Tessa looked down, page after page, line after line, access dates and times, file names, clearance levels, time opened, time closed. There were the times she had accessed things within her scope, and the times she had gone beyond it. All of it. Weeks of it, printed in chronological order, neat and clean, with the out-of-scope lines highlighted. He didn't only know that she had accessed those files last night. He had been watching for a very long time before that. "I'm giving you one chance to explain," Grant said, his voice flat, neither rising nor falling. "Only one." Tessa looked at the file, then looked up. She had 2 choices: lie and hope he believed her, or tell the truth, at least part of it, and hope it was enough. She chose the second. "My brother's name was Jamie Knight. He was 22 years old. 3 years ago, he worked as a trainee accountant at a small company outside Chicago. That company was a shell. He discovered irregularities in the books. 1 month later, he died in an accident the police concluded showed no signs of anything suspicious." She paused for a beat. "I didn't believe that conclusion. I searched for 3 years, and I found out that shell company was connected to Harlow Holdings." Grant didn't react. His face stayed unchanged. "I came here to find the truth, and I found it." Tessa continued, her voice slow and clear. "The order didn't come from you. It came from your father, Raymond Harlow, a $50,000 payment through Sentinel Guard LLC into Carl Bremer's hands, in the exact month my brother died. Your father gave the order. Bremer carried it out. Your father is dead now. Bremer now works for Novak." The room was quiet. Sunlight through the glass laid a long strip of brightness across the floor between them. Grant said nothing. He tapped one finger against the desk, slowly, evenly, 1 beat at a time, like the sound of a clock counting inside an empty room. Then he asked, his voice unchanged, "What did you find on Novak?" Tessa was stunned. She had just told him that his father had been connected to her brother's death. She had just admitted she had entered Harlow Holdings with her own purpose. And the question he chose to ask wasn't, "Who are you spying for?" It wasn't, "Who sent you here?" He asked about Novak. And in that moment, Tessa understood. Grant had known. Not today, not since last night when she accessed the higher clearance files. He had known longer than that. Maybe from the first week, when he ordered her watched. Maybe from the moment he read her background and saw the 2-year gap with no employment record. He had allowed her to continue not because he trusted her, He had allowed her to continue because he wanted to see who stood behind her. He was fishing, and she was the bait. The question about Novak was his way of saying, I know you're hiding more than what you just told me, but I care more about what you found than why you were looking. 2 of Novak's 3 companies have abnormal revenue, Tessa answered, her voice steady again. Money is flowing in from an outside source. I haven't identified the source yet, but the financial structure shows he's preparing to expand. Very fast. Grant stopped tapping his finger. He stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked toward the door. When he passed Tessa, he stopped. He didn't turn his head. You still work here. But from now on, you work for me, not for anyone else. Then he opened the door and walked out. The door closed. Tessa sat alone in Grant Harlow's office, afternoon sunlight still falling through the glass, the access log still open on the desk, and she realized she was in a position she had never imagined. She had been caught, and she had been kept. She didn't know which of those 2 things was more frightening. Everything collapsed on a Wednesday morning. Tessa was sitting on the 12th floor, opening the accounting system to prepare for cross-checking the weekly report, when she heard noise from downstairs. Not ordinary noise. The sound of the main lobby doors being shoved open hard, the sound of many footsteps at once on the stone floor, loud voices, someone shouting, "Don't touch anything." Then the elevator opened. They weren't Harlow employees. People in dark blue jackets, white letters printed across their backs, stepped out with search warrants in their hands. FBI. The 12th floor broke open in less than 3 minutes. Employees rose from their desks, some backing into corners, some running into the hallway only to turn back because the hallway had already been blocked. The FBI team split into smaller groups, each group entering a room, collecting computers, sealing hard drives, boxing up documents. One person placed a seal notice on Tessa's computer. Don't touch the equipment. Ma'am, you can stand to the side. Tessa stood up and stepped back toward the wall. She watched them press seal tape across the monitor, across the hard drive, even across the file boxes beside her desk. Everything she had accessed, every file she had opened, every piece of data she had studied for weeks, was now in federal hands. But Tessa didn't panic because of the computer. She panicked because through the glass door of her office, she had just seen 2 FBI agents leading a woman down the 12th floor hallway toward the elevator. Margaret Harlow. She walked with her back straight, her head unbowed, her eyes fixed ahead, but her hands were shaking. Both hands were clasped together in front of her stomach, shaking clearly, though she tried to hold them still. She didn't resist. She didn't say a word. She passed Tessa's office door without looking in. Maybe she didn't know Tessa was standing there. Maybe she knew and chose not to look. The elevator doors closed. Margaret disappeared. Tessa stood against the wall, her heart beating fast, her mind processing 10 pieces of information at once. The FBI had a search warrant, which meant someone had provided evidence heavy enough to convince a judge to sign it. That evidence was aimed at Margaret, not Grant, because they had taken her away and no one else. Who had provided the evidence? And what did that evidence say? At the same time, on the 15th floor, Grant was in a closed-door meeting with the in-house lawyer when his bodyguard pushed the door open, his face white. FBI, they're downstairs. They have a search warrant. Grant stood immediately. He didn't ask anything else. He walked straight to the elevator and went down to the lobby. But when the elevator doors opened on the 1st floor, he saw the black convoy parked in front of the main entrance. The door of the 2nd vehicle was closing. Through the car window, he saw his mother sitting inside, both hands on her lap, her eyes staring straight ahead. The car rolled away. Grant stood at the lobby entrance, watching the FBI convoy turn onto the main road and vanish around the corner. His bodyguard stood behind him. "Boss, what do we do?" Grant didn't answer. He stood there. The morning Chicago sunlight poured into the glass lobby, bright and harsh. Around him, employees hurried back and forth, some making phone calls, some standing helplessly as they watched the FBI carry boxes of documents out to the cars. And Grant stood in the middle of it all, silent, looking toward the road the car had just taken. For the first time in a very long while, he didn't know what the next step was. On the 12th floor, Tessa acted. When the FBI left her office to move into the room next door, she had less than 1 minute. The computer had been sealed. She couldn't open it. But she didn't need the computer. She needed her memory. Through weeks of working with Harlow data, she had memorized the most important numbers, the transaction codes, the account names, The main money flows. Not all of it, but enough. She took a pen and several blank sheets of paper from her handbag, bent over the desk, and began to write. Her hand moved quickly across the paper, one number after another, one account code after another, every transaction date she could remember. She wrote while the hallway outside was still filled with the noise of footsteps and cardboard boxes bumping against each other. She wrote until she heard footsteps returning toward her office, then stopped, folded the sheets, and slipped them into her coat pocket. When the FBI returned to the room, Tessa was standing by the wall, empty-handed, her face normal, as if she were only an employee waiting to be allowed to leave. They let her go. She walked into the hallway, turned into the restroom, and locked the door. She pulled out the sheets of paper and read them again. Then she thought back to the evidence the FBI must have had in order to arrest Margaret. If that evidence said Margaret had directly operated the illegal money flow, then it was wrong. Tessa knew it was wrong, because she had been reading the real data for weeks. The money flowed from Raymond Harlow, through shell companies, into the real estate network, then back again. Margaret didn't appear anywhere in that chain. Not a single transaction carried her name. Not a single account was linked to her. If the FBI had evidence showing Margaret was in control, then that evidence wasn't real. Someone had planted a trap, and Tessa knew exactly who had the ability, who had the motive, and who had system access to do it. Novak, or more precisely, the person inside Harlow who was working for Novak, the insider that the 2:17 in the morning transaction had already pointed to. Tessa slipped the papers into her coat pocket, opened the restroom door, and stepped into the hallway. The FBI was still working across the floors. Harlow employees stood clustered in the lobby, every face pale. Tessa didn't stand with them. She walked straight toward the elevator and pressed the button for the 15th floor. She needed to find Grant. Right now. The elevator opened on the 15th floor. Tessa stepped out. The hallway was empty. Most of the employees on this floor had been ordered by the FBI to go down to the lobby and wait. Grant's bodyguard stood in front of the private office door, his face tense, his arms crossed over his chest. He watched Tessa approach and blocked her path. Mr. Harlow isn't seeing anyone right now. He needs to see me, right now. The bodyguard didn't move. Tessa pulled the handwritten sheets from her coat pocket and held them up. Tell him I know who's behind his mother's arrest, and I have proof. The bodyguard looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he turned back, opened the door, and said something inside. The door opened fully. Tessa walked in. Grant was standing behind his desk, the phone pinned between his shoulder and ear, one hand gripping the back of his chair. He was speaking into the phone, his voice low, fast, and sharp. I want every transaction with Novak's Western line cut off within 24 hours. Freeze all intermediary accounts. And find me everything connected to Carl Bremer. He was striking back, in the way of the underworld, cutting off financial sources, cutting off business ties, choking Novak from the inside, fast, effective, and completely outside the law. Tessa didn't wait for him to hang up. Stop. Grant looked at her. His eyes were colder than she had ever seen them. He wasn't used to being interrupted. No one in this organization interrupted him, ever. I'll call you back, he said into the phone, then set it down on the desk, slowly, controlled. But Tessa saw his fingers tighten around the back of the chair until the knuckles went white. Do you want revenge, or do you want your mother out of there? Tessa said, her voice refusing to retreat. Because you don't get both. Grant looked at her, his jaw hardened. Who do you think you're talking to? I'm talking to a man whose mother has just been arrested. And if that man strikes back at Novak through underground methods right now, the FBI will have one more reason to keep her there. Every illegal move you make from this moment on will become evidence against your family, including your mother. Grant didn't answer, but he didn't pick up the phone either. Tessa placed the handwritten sheets on the desk, right in front of him. I've been working with Harlow Holdings' financial data for weeks. I know where the real money flow runs. Margaret Harlow doesn't appear in any transaction. Not one account is in her name. The people operating the money flow were your father, and then you. If the FBI has evidence saying your mother directly ran it, then that evidence is fake. Someone planted it in the system. She pointed to the paper. I wrote down the real transaction codes before the computers were sealed. Compare them with the evidence the FBI is holding, and they'll see immediately what's real and what was planted. And the planted trail will lead straight back to Novak. Grant looked at the sheets. Tessa's handwriting was small and dense, one number after another, one account code after another. This was what she had written down in the few chaotic minutes on the 12th floor, from memory, by hand, while the FBI was sealing everything around her. But if you hand this evidence to the FBI, Tessa continued, her voice slowing, they'll verify the real data, and the real data will reveal the entire underground financial structure of Harlow Holdings. Your mother will be cleared, Novak will be prosecuted, but your empire will be exposed too. The room was silent. Outside the glass windows, Chicago blazed under the midday sun. Grant turned his back to Tessa and looked out the window. She looked at his back, at the broad, straight shoulders, but there was something heavier than usual in the way he stood. "Do you know what that means for me?" he asked, his voice low. "I know. It meant everything. It meant the empire his father had built, the empire he had carried on his shoulders for 4 years, would collapse. It meant he would face the law. It meant the Harlow name would no longer make anyone afraid. It meant he had to choose his mother, or choose power. He couldn't have both. Grant stood at the window for another 10 seconds, the longest 10 seconds Tessa had ever counted. Then he turned back to the desk, picked up the phone, and dialed a different number. Not his bodyguard's number, not the number of anyone in the organization. "Arthur, I need to see you today. This is a federal case. Arthur Keene, the top criminal attorney in Chicago, not the Harlow family lawyer, a private attorney Grant had never needed to use, until today." Everything after that happened quickly. Arthur Keene arrived within 2 hours. Negotiations with the federal prosecutor's office began that same afternoon. Grant provided initial information through his attorney in exchange for a review of the evidence against Margaret. The FBI agreed to verify it once they saw that the data Tessa provided had a clear structure and could be cross-checked. By evening, a preliminary agreement had been reached. Grant would cooperate fully, providing the entire financial structure of Harlow Holdings, in exchange for Margaret's charges being reconsidered and Novak becoming the primary target. But there was one final step. The cooperation agreement required Grant's direct signature. The next morning, Grant went to the federal prosecutor's office. He wore a gray suit and brought no bodyguards, only Arthur Keene with him. He sat down at the table and read through the agreement, page by page, clause by clause. Then he picked up the pen. He paused for 1 second. Only 1 second, looking down at the paper where the signature line waited. Signing here meant the Harlow Empire was over. Everything his father had built. Everything he had carried. Every night he hadn't slept. Every decision he had been forced to carry for 4 years. All of it ended with a signature on a sheet of paper in a gray room inside a federal building. He signed, set the pen down, stood up, said nothing more. Arthur Keene shook the prosecutor's hand. Grant walked to the door. He stepped out of the federal building and stood on the concrete steps, looking out at the street. The Chicago sky was gray, the clouds low, the cold wind blowing in from Lake Michigan. He wasn't the boss anymore. He wasn't the head of an empire. He wasn't the name that made an entire room fall silent when he walked in. He was only a 33-year-old man, standing alone in front of a federal building, having just chosen his mother over everything else. 3 days after Grant signed the agreement, the FBI finished verifying the data. The result was exactly as Tessa had pointed out. The evidence against Margaret was fake, planted inside Harlow's financial system from within by an internal account whose trail led straight to Novak's network. The intermediary lawyer Margaret had trusted for 20 years. The man who arranged the first meeting between her and Tessa was the one who had been selling information to Novak for a long time. He gave Novak everything. The fact that Margaret was gathering evidence. The fact that she had hired an outsider to enter Harlow. And most importantly, the system access he still retained from Raymond's time. Novak used that access to plant false evidence, frame Margaret, and then leak it to the FBI. One move aimed at 2 targets: remove Margaret from the game and throw Grant into chaos. But that move hadn't accounted for Tessa Knight. The FBI arrested Novak on the morning of the 4th day. That same day, the charges against Margaret were cleared. She was released in the afternoon, exhausted, her face pale, but retaining her quiet dignity as she stepped out of the federal detention facility on the south side of Chicago. The person waiting for her outside the door wasn't Grant. Grant was being questioned separately on another floor of the same building, as part of the cooperation agreement he had signed. He had to answer hundreds of questions about the structure of Harlow Holdings, about the transactions, about the names and numbers he had carried in his head for 4 years. He couldn't leave. The person waiting for Margaret was Tessa. She stood beside a bench outside the gate, holding a bottle of water and a thin coat. No flowers, no lawyer, no sleek black car. Just a 27-year-old woman whom Margaret had hired 3 months earlier to break apart her son's empire. Margaret stepped out, saw Tessa, and stopped. The two women looked at each other. Margaret looked older than she had at their meeting in the cafe. Not older because of age, but older because of exhaustion. 3 days in a federal holding room, without sleep, without proper meals, not knowing where her son was or what he was doing. 3 days she had sat in silence, refusing to say a word, prepared to take the blame for her son without knowing that her son was signing away his empire to save her. Tessa handed her the bottle of water. Margaret looked at the bottle, then at Tessa. "Why are you still here?" Her voice was hoarse, smaller than Tessa had ever heard it. No cold edge, no control, only the question of a person worn down and unable to understand why anyone would be standing there waiting for her. "Because I know what it feels like to lose family and have no one standing beside you," Tessa said. Margaret looked at her. And for the first time since this story began, since the meeting in the cafe, since the moment she placed a file in front of a stranger and said, "I need evidence," since the moment she looked straight into Tessa's eyes without blinking while Tessa called her a chess piece, Margaret Harlow cried. Not loudly, not collapsing. She only stood there, her back straight, while tears ran down both cheeks, silent and impossible to stop. Tessa said nothing more. She handed Margaret the coat. Margaret took it, draped it over her shoulders, and the two women sat down on the bench to wait. 40 minutes later, Grant stepped out. He looked tired. His suit was wrinkled. His tie had been removed, and there were dark circles beneath his eyes. He saw his mother sitting on the bench, with Tessa beside her. He stopped a few steps away. Then he walked over. Tessa stood, gave up her seat, and stepped back. She understood this wasn't her moment. Grant sat down beside his mother. Margaret looked at her son. Her eyes were still red. She opened her mouth, but her voice didn't come out right away. She had to swallow once before she could speak. "I'm sorry." Grant looked straight ahead, not at his mother. "I tried to control you instead of trusting you. I thought I knew how to save you, but I never asked whether you wanted to be saved." Grant kept looking forward. Then he said, his voice low and flat, "I knew you hired Tessa." Margaret froze. Her entire body went rigid on the bench. "I've known for a long time," Grant continued, still not turning to look at her, "since I had someone check her background and found a 2-year gap with no employment record. Since I saw her working like someone searching for something. I didn't know exactly who was behind her, but I knew there was someone. I let her continue because I wanted to see the mastermind reveal themselves." He paused. "Then, when I began to understand the mastermind might be you, I still didn't stop it." Margaret looked at her son, her eyes wide, her lips slightly parted, but she couldn't speak. "Why?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Grant finally turned to look at his mother. His eyes weren't cold. They weren't sharp. For the first time, they were only the eyes of a tired man. "Because maybe I also wanted someone to force me to stop." Margaret looked at her son, and in that moment, she understood something she should have understood long ago. Her son hadn't held on to the empire because he wanted power. He had held on because no one had given him a reason to let go. She had tried to save him by betraying him. But what he needed wasn't betrayal or salvation. He needed someone to say, "You're allowed to stop." She said nothing more. She only reached out and took her son's hand. Grant didn't pull away. Mother and son sat on the bench in front of the federal detention facility, the late afternoon Chicago sunlight slanting through the trees, and neither of them said another word. 2 weeks passed after the day Margaret was released. Novak was indicted on 17 federal charges, including financial fraud, planting false evidence, and operating an illegal interstate money flow network. Carl Bremer was arrested the same day and confessed that he had worked for Novak for 3 years after leaving Harlow. The intermediary lawyer Margaret had trusted was charged separately with conspiracy and breach of fiduciary trust. Harlow Holdings entered a restructuring phase under federal supervision. Assets were inventoried. The illegal business divisions were shut down. Drew Harlow, the only person in the family who had never been involved in the underworld, was appointed to oversee the process of turning the charity division into the main pillar of the new corporation. Grant continued cooperating with the FBI every day, answering questions, providing documents, signing paperwork. He did all of it calmly, without complaint, without delay, like a man cleaning out a house he had known for a long time he would have to leave. In the middle of all that, Tessa received a call from the federal prosecutor's office in New York. Novak's trial would take place there, and she was required to serve as an expert witness on the financial structure. She needed to be in New York within 2 weeks. It wasn't a request. It was a subpoena. Tessa wasn't surprised. She had known this would come. She began packing up the apartment in the West Loop. There wasn't much. She had never truly lived there. This apartment had only been the place where she slept, wrote numbers into the leather-covered notebook, and looked at Jamie's photograph before turning off the light. A few cardboard boxes, a few bags of clothes, one suitcase. Her life had always been light like that, ready to leave at any moment, because she had never had a reason to stay anywhere for very long. She was folding clothes into the suitcase when she heard a knock at the door. Not a hard knock. 2 soft knocks, slow and quiet. She opened the door. Grant stood in the hallway. No bodyguard, no suit. He wore a gray shirt, car keys in his hand, looking like an ordinary man stopping by to see someone after work. But he wasn't an ordinary man, and this wasn't an ordinary visit. "You're packing," he said, looking over her shoulder into the apartment. "The trial in New York, a subpoena." "I know." Tessa turned back and continued folding clothes, leaving the door open. Grant stepped inside and stood beside the kitchen counter, looking around the small apartment. Cardboard boxes on the floor, an open suitcase on the bed, the kitchen table empty, the leather-covered notebook lying beside the suitcase. He looked at that notebook longer than anything else in the room. Then he said, his voice no louder than the ceiling fan turning above them, "You came here because of hatred. Why did you stay?" Tessa stopped. She was holding a coat, half folded, and she stayed in that position for a few seconds. Not because she didn't know the answer, because she was deciding how much of it to say. Then she set the coat down and turned to look at him. "Because I saw someone trying to get out but not knowing how." The apartment was quiet. The sound of traffic outside felt distant, faded. The pale yellow kitchen light fell across both their faces. Grant didn't answer right away. He looked at Tessa, not with the measuring gaze she had known from the first day in the conference room. Not like a boss weighing the value of a piece on the board. He looked at her as if she were someone he had watched many times through security cameras, through conference room glass, through late-night work sessions, but had never truly seen until now. The silence stretched. This was the last silence between them, and it was heavier than all the others, because this time neither of them was hiding anything. "I don't know how to live a normal life," Grant said. His voice wasn't the voice of a boss, wasn't the voice of command, wasn't the voice of the man who made an entire room go silent when he entered. It was the voice of someone telling the truth, maybe for the first time in a very long while. "I don't know how to wake up without thinking about who wants to hurt me. I don't know how to trust someone without checking their background first. I don't know how to talk to anyone without calculating what they want from me." He stopped. "But if I have to learn, I want you there." Tessa looked at him. She had heard many words in her life. Promises from coworkers, commitments from clients, comfort from friends after Jamie was gone. Most of those words had been as light as paper, drifting away before they ever touched the ground. But what Grant had just said wasn't light. It was heavy. Heavy because he wasn't used to speaking this way. Heavy because she knew every word he had just spoken had to pass through a wall he had spent his whole life building. She said nothing. She looked at him for a few more seconds. Then she turned toward the bed and looked at the open suitcase, with clothes folded halfway inside it. She lifted the suitcase. Grant didn't move. His face didn't change. But something in his eyes darkened, as if he had prepared himself for this answer before he ever came here. Tessa set the suitcase down on the floor. Not on the bed so she could keep packing. On the floor. She closed the lid. Then she stood straight, both hands at her sides, and looked at him. That was the answer. No words, no dramatic kiss, no embrace, no tears. Only a suitcase set down on the floor in a small apartment in the West Loop, beneath the pale yellow kitchen light, between two people who had hidden too much from each other, and finally admitted the thing they had both known for a long time, but neither had dared to say first. 2 years later, Grant Harlow completed his cooperation agreement with the FBI. The entire underground financial structure of Harlow Holdings was disclosed, examined, and shut down. The corporation was restructured into a fully legal business, focused on commercial real estate and a clean restaurant chain. Drew Harlow took charge of the Charity and Community Education Division, turning it into the second pillar of the new corporation. He was still the only person in the family who smiled easily, and now that smile had one more reason behind it. Novak was sentenced to 23 years in federal prison. Karl Bremer received 12 years. The intermediary lawyer received 8 years for conspiracy and breach of fiduciary trust. None of them successfully appealed. Margaret Harlow stepped away from every business operation. She sold the old mansion in the Gold Coast and moved into a smaller apartment near Lake Michigan, where she could walk every morning without needing anyone beside her. Every Sunday, she cooked dinner for her 2 sons. Grant arrived on time. Drew arrived 15 minutes late, every single time. Dinner wasn't always easy. Sometimes there were long silences between dishes. Sometimes Margaret said something and Grant didn't answer. Sometimes Drew had to tell a long, meaningless story just to fill the empty space. But they still came. Every Sunday. Not one week missed. The mother and son relationship between Margaret and Grant wasn't perfect. Maybe it would never be perfect, but it was real. And real was enough. Tessa Knight didn't return to New York after the trial. She completed her witness duty in 3 weeks, then flew back to Chicago. She opened a small auditing firm downtown, specializing in helping small and medium businesses build transparent financial systems. The firm had only 5 people, with an office rented on the 3rd floor of an old building near the Chicago River. No bronze nameplate, no glass lobby, but every client's books were clean, and Tessa wanted to keep them that way. She and Grant lived together in an ordinary apartment in Lincoln Park, not a penthouse, not the family mansion. 2 bedrooms, 1 living room, and 1 balcony overlooking a quiet alley lined with maple trees. Grant learned to cook breakfast on weekends. The results were uneven, sometimes good and sometimes not. But he cooked every week. Tessa still worked late, but now, when she came home, someone was waiting. And that was something she hadn't had since Jamie was gone. One Sunday morning, before dinner at Margaret's, Tessa drove to Oak Hill Cemetery on the western outskirts of Chicago. She went alone, as she always did. She stopped in front of a simple headstone, gray stone, engraved with Jamie Knight's name and 2 numbers. The year of his birth, the year of his death. She stood there for a while. The morning wind moved softly through the trees around her. Then she placed her hand on the headstone, her palm pressed against the cold stone, and whispered, "I found the truth, and I found a reason to keep going." She stood there for a few more seconds. Then she lowered her hand, turned back, and walked toward the parking lot. Grant was leaning against the car door, waiting for her. He didn't ask what she had said. He only opened the car door for her, then walked around to the driver's seat. On the way back, Chicago was bright with morning sun. The light reflected on the river, glittering between the rows of tall buildings. Grant drove with one hand. His other hand rested over Tessa's. No words, no need for words. Sometimes love isn't something gentle. There is a kind of love willing to betray in order to protect. The way a mother trades her child's trust to save him. There is a kind of love that stays silent. The way a man lets go of an entire empire because he doesn't want to lose his mother. And there is a kind of love that begins in hatred. The way a young woman walks into enemy territory and finds there the person she never expected. Life doesn't always give us easy choices, but in the hardest choices, we see who we truly are. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the story. If this story touched you, please press like and share it so more people can hear it too. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment and share the feelings deep in your heart. We always want to listen to you. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, because the best stories are still ahead. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every single day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.